Okay. Okay, welcome everybody in the library to Delft. Thanks for being here. Today we'll have a discussion, or do we have a discussion? Because basically we're all on the same side. We're trying to answer the question, how to do good, how to do good for the world. So that's maybe not much of a discussion to start with, but the question becomes how to do good in the best possible way. Um, and that might open up a discussion. And we have invited, or Studium General has invited a number of people who can approach this question from a number of angles. First, we have Jan Wehner from Effective Altruism Delft. He's one of the co-founders, one of the founders, so a co-founder, which is one particular way of dealing with the question how to do good. Then we have Eduard Nassarski, previously from both Amnesty International and the Dutch Council for Refugees, Vluchtelingenwerk. So a lot of experience with dealing with also this question how to do good for the world, human rights, etc. Currently an independent expert on human rights. And we have Kritika Maheshwari from our university, assistant professor at Ethics and Philosophy of Technology of the TPM faculty, which is also where I'm located. I'm Budapest. I will be the moderator. What we will do today is basically first having two presentations, then a short break to get some additional refreshments, and then a third presentation. After that, we can have an in-depth discussion on what we've learned. Okay, the order of things is that first Jan will have a presentation, then Eduard, and after the break, Kritika. So I'll now give the floor to Jan.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Yeah, I'll be sharing a bit of the perspective of the effective altruism community today about how we can use our money and our donations to really do the most good and use them effectively. The effective altruism community really tries to approach the question, how can we have the most positive impact? And we try to pose that kind of like a scientific question, and we try to use evidence and careful reasoning to really figure out how we can do the most good in the world. And then obviously also actually do it. And one of the core topics we do talk about is how can we effectively donate? How can we donate so it really helps people in the best way possible? And I'll kind of try to make three connected claims. The first being that with donations, we can actually do an immense amount of good, that there's huge differences in how effective different charities are at doing good, and then go a bit into how we can go about choosing effective charities. So let me first pose a question to anybody who's not seen this before. So back right is out. The median Dutch income, I think, is like something like 30,000 euros after taxes. So the question here is, in the richest, like what richest percent of people does that put you in the world? If you rank all the people by how rich they are, what percentage does this put people in? Just feel free to scream out your best guesses here.
This is a microphone, by the way. Anyone?
5%? Anybody else?
Any advance on that?
1%? All right, that's actually, if we take the average, that's really, really close. It's giving what we can estimate it at roughly 2.9%. And when I first saw this, I found it very impressive, actually, that we are in such a privileged situation, that we are among the richest people in the world. And a lot of people here are well educated and will probably be able to go over 30,000 as well. So I think this just puts us in a position where we have an immense opportunity to do good in the world with these resources that we have. So we have an immense opportunity to use our riches to help those who are less privileged than us. And to illustrate that even if you were to give away 10% of your income, you'd still be in the 3.6% richest people in the world, which I think is still plenty enough to live a very good life, while also doing a massive amount of good if you donate it to very effective charities. So giving what we can estimates that with just this 10% per year, with a Dutch median income, you can save 1.1 lives per year. Let that sink in for a second, because I think this number is incredibly impressive. But importantly, this is only the case if we donate to very effective charities. And I'm going to claim that there is actually large differences between how effective charities are at doing good in the real world. So let's take two examples. One, both of them trying to address the problem of blindness. So one approach to this would be to train a guide dog, which costs you approximately 40,000 euros. And I'm sure makes the life of a blind person much better if they have such a guide dog available. On the other hand, you can perform cataract surgery, which down here says that it only costs 1,000 euros, which means you can perform 1,000 cataract surgeries, which massively help people with blindness or severe vision impairments to be able to see better or see again. So this kind of means you can do 40 of that for one of that. And I think it's like very clear which one of those is more effective, and that there is actually a quite impressive difference between those two charities. And this statistic applies widely. So here on the x-axis, Toby Orton maps a lot of different charities in global health to try to save lives or improve lives. And then on the y-axis is how effective they are at saving and improving lives per dollar donated. And we definitely see a very strong tail distribution here, in that the most effective, cost-effective charities are like 100 to 1,000 times more effective than a median charity. And I think this clearly shows that it's very important for us to figure out what are the most effective charities, and then actually give to them. I think an interesting question is, why is this not the normal way that donation is approached? Because to me, that sounds like a very plausible way to donate. It's just figure out where your money can do the most good and donate there. I think, first of all, like, charity doesn't seem to be a very efficient market. So when you have a business which has a product which is more expensive and worse than another business product, this business is going to go out of business. They're not going to be around for very long. But for a charity which is less effective and provides less value than another charity, I think they will mostly still get the same amount of donations, because donors don't really take this into consideration very strongly. And they couldn't even, because they don't have very good information about which charity does what amount of good. I think also there's a lot of human biases at play. First of all, I imagine the way people make donations is very strongly that they look at which cause connects with them, and they make a donation to that cause, which I think is a very kind way to make donations. But another way to approach it would be to look at, I'm willing to give this amount of money to make the world better, and then try to look at research and listen to experts and see which charity can really use my money to make the world better the most and really has the most impact. And I think also there's biases like that we kind of neglect the scale of things. So saving one person's life is incredibly amazing, and that feels amazing as well. But saving 100 people's lives still just feels very amazing, is incredible. It's not 100 times as incredible. So our emotions and our intuitive understanding doesn't really take this into consideration. So I think it's worth to sometimes use our just rational brain to make these decisions as well. So now, after I've talked about how important it is to give to effective charities, here's some advice on how to figure out which charities might be very effective. And this can kind of be split into two parts. So first of all, we can look at what problems are most important, what problems do we want to address, and then in a second part, we can look at which charities can actually effectively address these problems. And to figure out which cause or which problem we most urgently need to address, the effective altruism community has kind of converged on these three criteria. So the first is the scale of the problem. So how big is the problem? If we solve the problem, how many people does this help? By how much does it help the people? And obviously we want to address problems that are bigger. But this is not the only thing, because if a problem is very big, but we can't do anything about it, then we shouldn't donate there. Instead, we want to donate to places to problems that are actually solvable and that are actually tractable and where we can actually make progress on the problems. And finally, charity might be very effective, but a problem might be very important, big in scale and tractable. But if there's already a lot of donations going into this area and a lot of people working on it, the best opportunities are already covered. And the additional money you will donate will not work on the best opportunities to address this problem anymore. Instead, if you donate to a problem which has very little money into it currently, you can still fund some of the best opportunities that would have otherwise not gone funded. So after we've picked our problem to address, we want to figure out which charity can most effectively address that problem. And here's 3 rough guidelines that could be used for this. The first one is that effectiveness is a core part of the mission of the charity. So you want to look for charities that use evidence-based strategies, so they clearly evaluate their programs, they're self-reflective, they try to run programs which are based on evidence and that are shown to work. Secondly, kind of obviously maybe, you want to look for charities that seem like they're very cost-effective in expectation. So cost-effectiveness, here we mean how much benefit does the charity provide? So how much good does it do? How much people does it save? And what are the costs? So how much money do they need to provide this amount of good? And then we just go ahead and divide the two, so the good done versus the funding they receive. And this roughly gives us the good done per dollar. And this is definitely a number that we want to be as high as possible. But the question is obviously very hard to figure out. So like, how do you go ahead and measure the benefits of a charity and the impact? These are super hard scientific questions. And it becomes even harder when you try to compare it between charities. So you might want to compare charity one which tries to save lives of humans, and another charity which tries to improve the lives of chickens in factory farming. How do you go about like comparing these two? These are very hard questions, but I think we shouldn't just throw our hands up and decide, this question is too hard, we're not going to figure it out, we just donate to whatever. Instead, I think we should, use our best scientific reasoning and evidence collecting to try to figure out these questions and then go with our best guess. And lastly, you want to give to charities that actually have need for more funding. If a charity is very effective, but it's fully funded already, they can't usefully spend money anymore, then you probably don't want to be donating to that charity. Instead, you want to donate to a charity which actually needs more money to run more cost-effective programs. And now you might be looking at this list and realizing that, wow, these questions are really hard to figure out. These are very hard questions, and I'd agree with you. Luckily, as with many other scientific questions, we can kind of listen to the research and listen to some experts and take some of their advice. So especially I'm thinking of looking at certain charity evaluators which really try to figure out where can people donate their money in the most cost-effective way. And one very popular one for this is GiveWell. So GiveWell is in the global health space, and they evaluate charities in global health. They have a very strong focus on evidence-based proof that programs actually work, and they do a lot, 20,000 hours per year of very rigorous research, publish that, and then give advice to donors where they can most effectively spend their money. And one of the charities they do recommend is the Against Malaria Foundation, which they estimate as very cost-effective, as saving a human life for 5,000 euros, which I think is incredibly impressive that, this is the price, basically. And what they do is give insecticide-treated bed nets to people in areas with high malaria rates, and then they can just hang it over their beds, which turns out to be very cheap and very cost-effective. Another one I want to shout out is animal charity evaluators. As you might be able to guess, they're looking at animal well-being and which charities most effectively address animal well-being. And one of the charities they recommend is the Good Food Institute, which tries to look at alternative proteins, tries to promote this, tries to make policy in the space, and do research and development. And in this way kind of try to end the suffering in factory farming by providing these alternatives. And they appear to do very effective work that actually moves the needle on these issues, and this is why they're recommended. Also, I definitely want to shout out Giving What We Can, because my whole talk is basically just based on their research, and they give a lot of really valuable advice on how you can give effectively. I think they're really the place to learn about these things. So yeah, if you want to learn more about effective donations, this is the place. And lastly, if you want to talk about this stuff in person, we have a community built around this in Delft as well, Effective Altruism Delft, where we learn about these things together, we discuss. So if that's interesting to you, come talk to me afterwards or some of the people in the back here. And finally, the question I would like to pose to the audience is, how should we make decisions about where we go and donate? And how can we figure out which charities are actually effective at doing good? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan. Yeah, the microphone is already being handed over to Eduard.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to come here. And I've been working for Amnesty International quite some time, and I figured in this topic that is highly interesting also to me personally, it would be best to give some examples from my own practice in Amnesty and just to tell you what happened over there. But before doing that, I would like to know, well, I suppose you have heard of Amnesty International, but could you say in one or half a sentence what Amnesty means to you, or what you think Amnesty is doing? Because then I can adapt my presentation a bit on these. So a few words, keywords on Amnesty, the goals, and etc.
Research on humanitarian law in countries, or
research humanitarian law. Yeah.
There must be more.
A campaigning organization that tries to impact policy changes around the world.
Well, thanks. And together, that's exactly what Amnesty is trying to do. So research on humanitarian law, on human rights abuses, human rights situations, and on, as a consequence of that, campaigning, lobbying, advocacy, and trying to improve things. So I have 4 very easy, I think, examples of what we are trying to do, and I will explain them. One of the things that Amnesty has done since 1961 is campaigning for prisoners of conscience, people that spoke out, that expressed their opinion on certain things. Amnesty started in 1961 when an English lawyer, Peter Benenson, heard about a story of 2 students in Portugal, then a dictator, Salazar, a dictatorship, Portugal, with Salazar as dictator. And they were in a pub, in a cafe, and they toasted on freedom. Well, Secret Service police saw that, and they were sentenced to 7 years jail. Peter Benenson heard about that and started campaigning for the release of those students, and that is how Amnesty started. We have been doing that for years and years and years, and we will keep on. We will keep on doing that in the next years too. And I'll give you one example also to show how. Yeah, one more. Thank you. To show how it can work. These are Laila and Arif Yunus from Azerbaijan. They lived in Baku, and they were very critical of the government of President Aliyev, who was still in charge. They were criticizing Aliyev because of corruption, because of repression, because of restricting the media, freedom of speech. And they were very critical when the European Olympic Games were in Baku, and they said, well, this is only sports washing, and they were very vocal about that. As a result of that, they were imprisoned. This is obviously not from prison. That is before that, and when they were in prison, they were treated very roughly, and they wrote a book on what happened to them. The book will be, is already in English, but will also be published in Dutch in a few weeks. And it is really, well, chilling to read what happened to them. She was not treated for diabetes and was in a very bad condition. He was beaten for a few weeks in a row every night on his head. As a result of that, they were very weak, and Amnesty heard about them because their daughter visited me in Amsterdam and said, you need to do something for my parents because they are imprisoned, etc. Well, after some research, as you said, we did, and we started campaigning. We started campaigning also internationally because they were really prisoners of conscience, to our opinion. And it's very difficult to say, and that is the first thing I would like to state, it's very difficult to say that because of Amnesty they were released, but at the end they were released. They were also released because of very good actions by a Dutch diplomat, the Dutch ambassador in Baku, whom I was in regular contact with on this case, but also EU diplomats who exerted some diplomatic pressure. Well, at the end, they were released. They live in Leiden now. They moved to Leiden and trying to rebuild their lives, which is very difficult. One of the difficulties they have is to try to get their way in Dutch bureaucracy, which is sometimes very difficult. But you can see here, actioning, campaigning, lobbying, advocacy can help on an individual level, and you can really save lives by doing this. But it's very difficult to say that because of Amnesty they were released. There were others involved. The second example is not a very cheerful example, I'm afraid, but well, having worked for Amnesty so long, I will not avoid also less cheerful topics. This is 2 weeks ago in Berlin, where I was just for a long weekend visiting Berlin, and I bumped into a demonstration of Iranians. They were protesting against the death penalty in Iran, and also now the fact that the Iranian government is really executing people that only were protesting, and they were peaceful protests. So they were doing that. I've worked for 14 years with Amnesty, so I was on my bike in Berlin, near the Brandenburger Tor, and yeah, obviously I got off my bike and I asked some of them, what's the idea, what are you doing? And the death penalty is one of the most cruel sentences you can imagine. And you can say, well, in this case, they had pictures of people that were executed, so Amnesty was not successful in doing that. And I also very vividly remember the execution of Troy Davis in the United States in 2011, when we were campaigning with all amnesties all over the world in order to prevent this execution. And at the end, we failed, and Troy Davis was executed by way of a lethal injection. And you can say then we failed, but on the other hand, advocating for human rights is also trying to keep hope and generating hope. And what we did in this campaign and in this action, without any doubt, led to some other people that joined us in the campaign against death penalty. And if you look in historical facts, in 1977, when Amnesty started campaigning against the death penalty, there were 16 countries, 1/6, that didn't execute the death penalty. Now it's 144 countries that do not execute the death penalty. So in terms of many decades and many years, you can see progress. But again, you cannot say that this is only because of Amnesty. There are many actors involved in this, and Amnesty certainly took a part, but we were not the only one. But you can see progress, and that is very important in order to be able to keep on doing this work. The third example is a very complex one. It is the International Criminal Court, not far from here in The Hague. Amnesty was one of the organizations that started campaigning for this in the beginning of the 90s. And people said, well, you're totally crazy, it will never work. And Amnesty did this because in severe human rights abuses and severe human rights violations, perpetrators should be held accountable. That is very, very important for getting to peace, getting to come at ease a bit with the past, and also for the victims, especially for the victims. So we started with others to campaign and to raise the idea, and shouldn't there be something like an international criminal court where people can be before the court in order to defend themselves, but the court can also have judgments against them. Many people said it will be impossible and you'll never make it. In 1998, the Statute of Rome was established and was agreed with the countries of the United Nations. and then it took 10 years more before the International Criminal Court started. And you can have a lot of criticism against the International Criminal Court. It used a lot of money, it is slow, and etc. But you saw recently that the court verdict that issued an arrest for President Putin in Russia, and that certainly is important, and that's important that I don't think he will be arrested shortly, and he will be before the International Criminal Court. But it's very important that also Putin, but also his supporters, and he has too many in Russia still, that they realize that if the war once is over, that Putin cannot travel freely across the world because very many countries promised to arrest him if he goes there. So that is important. And you can see again, it's not only amnesty, and it took an extremely long time for the International Criminal Court to come into being, but it has been important, and it is there, and it functions more or less. And now, a last one. I said to Lester when we briefly spoke about preparation for this, I also want to share something where we didn't succeed, because, well, that could also be a lesson learned or interesting. This is a campaign we started and we did in the end of 2015, so almost 8 years ago now. And it says over there, leaders of Europe, not the polls you should worry about, is the history books. And then the leaders of Europe were trying to build walls, fences around Europe, which we said they shouldn't do, and which, as you all know, they did. And they did more, they did pushbacks, etc. So, well, you could say here, totally in vain, and you didn't make it. Because, well, one of the biggest disappointments in my career, if you could call it career, was that we demanded things of governments in the migration field that they simply didn't listen to, they simply didn't do. And even now, when tomorrow, I don't know if you follow Dutch politics, tomorrow the Liberal Party will have their conference, and there will be a lot of talk about restricting migration to the Netherlands, and they will all have only fake and nonsensical proposals that I want to bet 2 beers on that. But we didn't make it, and still I think it was worth that we try to, and I hope, and well, I'm not involved anymore, I hope Amnesty will keep on doing this, because somebody has to say this is wrong what Europe is doing, and somebody has to raise his, her, their voice about this. And that is a last thing I wanted to say. Even if you're not successful immediately or not in the end or after 8 years, well, you can say, well, you were simply not successful. Sometimes it can be important to raise your voice, to keep on raising your voice in order to support not only refugees, but also people around Europe that think it is worthwhile to try to stand up for refugees. And that is what I hope Amnesty will be doing, despite the fact that until now we have not been successful. Well, that is what I wanted to tell you in 4 examples. And my question to you, or my, maybe more, I don't know if a thesis maybe, would be, even if you are not immediately successful, or maybe in years not successful, it can be worthwhile to keep on doing what you're doing in activities, even if it costs some money, some staff energy, some budget, because, well, somebody has to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we heard now 2 accounts. On both we, I think, fully agree. You know, we have to spend money on charities in the best possible way, as Jan was contending. But yeah, as it was also clear, it is really hard to assess success. And I think the story also made clear about, I mean, you also have to indicate, you have to leverage for certain values. You have to show, hey, this is important before you can actually make the assessment, well, where your money should be put. So that really complicates the story of, I mean, you already gave this complication. So yeah, how to match ideals with reality, that's, I think, the basic questions that all of us have. Let's get a drink for a couple of minutes, catch up, and then afterwards Kritika will give some reflections from more theoretical point of view, I suggest, expect. See you in a couple of minutes. So everybody's back. So let's start again, and let's do a short round of Q&A. So if people, I mean, you have been discussing all these things also during the break. Maybe there are still questions from Eduard and Jan, also from the audience. That you cannot wait until discussion up.
Yeah.
Yeah, this question is for the three of you, or any. Yeah, but it's more focused on the first presentation, because I got the feeling that the statement was something like the charity organization should be seen as a market, and that's why one should. And that market is not perfect market, right? And that's why this kind of information tools allows to just that those organizations which are not that efficient just disappear, right? But I feel something wrong about looking at social change and charity as a market, right? Otherwise, it would be a market. So, what is your take on that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure seeing it as a market is like the perfect way to do it. I was mostly arguing that this is a reason why we would expect less cost-effective charities to not be there, to still like exist, because there's not this competitive pressure. In fact, I think if we were to only purely measure cost effectiveness, I think we would probably weed out some charities which are quite relevant and could do important work, which maybe, because our cost effectiveness measures are maybe not perfect and they maybe don't capture everything that we want. But I find it kind of a useful framing as well, because as a donor, I want to give money where it can do the most good. And if there's one option which does more good than another, then I want to be able to choose that. So it's kind of, it is somewhat like a product of like the value you get for your money.
Any response from the table?
Well, I'm totally in agreement with what Jan said, but maybe another aspect. One of the big advantages of free societies like the Dutch society or the German or the English or the French is that everyone that wants to establish an organization or take an initiative in society can do so, if it's more or less within the law or within the constitution at least. That is a big advantage. But a disadvantage of that is that you can have multiple small organizations that are more or less targeting or more or less working on the same goal. And you could see that, for example, when the crisis in Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine started, that very many people thought, well, we need to do something now. So they hired a truck and went there with all kind of stuff, which sometimes was, well, totally not useful. So if you have done more established organizations, there can be, of a bit more established, there can be some competition, and that can be a market. And just on my own field, between Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, there is certainly collaboration, but sometimes also some competition on bigger donors or possible funds. Well, and you could say, well, that's very bad, but from the other hand, well, you can't prevent them for going to the Dutch postal code lottery, and you can't prevent Amnesty for going there and trying to have a positive bid as possible. So to some extent, competition is good, I think. And sometimes this competition also leads to improved collaboration, which is also good. And if I look at the field of refugees, for instance, you can see in very many European countries, there are large organizations that are very well equipped, but you can also see new initiatives that are taking that have a lot of energy, that have new approaches, and that have a lot of attention in media, and that also have some successes in lobbying and advocacy. So, well, to some extent, there is a market, and, well, there's nothing wrong with some market idea, as long as you don't have the Thatcher-Reagan idea of everything is market. So, well, you are competing for public attention, for public support, and there is some effect of a market.
So, yeah.
I think this starts with a question for Jan. effective altruism, as you mentioned it, is how to do the most good. And I think there has then first has to be the question: how do you define good? So I see it more effective altruism more as a way of when you've chosen your goals. So my own goals, and I felt that very much with a follow-up speaker. So he was very passionate, or at least you could feel that. So you first have to choose what, and when you've chosen that, you can also hopefully choose your metric, and then you can go into the effective altruism. So doing good as the how to do good starts with choosing, and that is very much depending indeed on. I mean, when I look at myself, I got exposed to certain charities, I felt a link with it, and then I looked into that, and then that's one way of choosing it. But there's also that also helped me define of what kind of good do I want to do. So with the Human Rights Watch, with nature, whatever else, that's the first step: choosing what, and then how.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think first of all, for the question of how to define what is actually good when we try to do the most good, this is obviously a super hard question. Ethicists have grappled with this for centuries or millennia, and we still don't have a clear answer. So I think the way to go here is to be uncertain about which moral theories are actually correct and kind of try to act in accordance with that, and try to take multiple points of view into account, and ideally do things which are like robustly good to many different approaches to do good. But I think you're also pointing at like that you kind of care about a certain cause and you care about a certain way of doing good. And yeah, I can definitely relate to that. But I also think it's sometimes worth to step back. And for me, my goal is fundamentally like to do the most good. And then I try to be kind of neutral about what cause actually allows me to achieve that. Like fundamentally, I care about helping humans and helping animals, generally like making the world better. But I'm kind of neutral about which cause is actually the best way to do this. So I try to not be super emotionally attached to one way of doing good. Instead, I try to, reason about and look at evidence for which way of doing good seems to be the most effective, which is the most pressing problems. And then I try to work on that.
The problem you cited is a relevant one, especially for effective altruists, because you want to quantify certain kind of goods so as to fit your metrics of cost effectiveness. Now, one response, as you said, was to accept some kind of moral uncertainty about which moral theory might be correct. That is true, but I'm not sure if that would be the exact response that can please someone who's confused about what goodness is. So you might say that for different people, there are different ideas of what goodness might stand for. And that should maybe be an argument in favor of being, let's say, pluralistic about what forms of goodness one may want to advocate for or support. But that particularly becomes a problem for effective altruists because not all kinds of goodness can be put on the same scale of metric and then can be measured in terms of cost effectiveness. And a philosophical issue and also a practice-based issue for that is that how do you end up then measuring how are you doing the most good, most effectively? So I would try to think of that as a serious challenge to at least the philosophical tenets of effective altruism without swaying away from the main idea of doing good as one sort of appeases to.
Yeah, I'll take a question about Amnesty International or the problem of advocacy in general. I think, so you said during the talk, well, someone has to say these things, and I think that's very true. But at the same time, there are a lot of things that should also be said, but that go left unsaid, right? Or that do not have a huge organization like Amnesty behind them. And also, probably a lot of people come to Amnesty and say, oh, please bring attention to this issue or that issue. So then how do you decide which ones are the most important or which ones do you actually try to set up a campaign for and which ones do you not do that for?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this question. That's one of the most difficult things I've experienced in the 14 years that I was in Amnesty. Because every meeting we had, every time I saw people, be it in Delft, be it somewhere in Arnhem or even in Johannesburg, everyone ask, could you step up this? Could you do more on this? Why are you silent on this? You should do this. This is injustice. And where is Amnesty? And even in a bigger organization, Amnesty Worldwide has 3,000 staff and 7 million supporters and a huge budget. But even in a bigger organization, you have to choose because there's almost no improvement in human rights that goes overnight. So you have to be very resilient, and you have to, to be aware that you have to fund some activities for a long time. And if you fund this activity, you can't do the same amount of that. So you have to choose. What we try to do, and we made mistakes, and Amnesty will keep on making mistakes, I think. But what we try to do is to first to assess the gravity of the human rights abuses, and secondly, to see where we think leverage could be reached, where we could exert some leverage. But we also looked at an analysis of where could we have the most added value. Because in some respects, like for instance in the Netherlands, and maybe that's a very tricky topic, but yeah, we had all these topics were tricky. When it comes to LGBTQI rights, we said at one point the Dutch organization COC is very good equipped, is very powerful, has entrance. So we collaborate with them, but there's no need for us to be then extremely active in this field. I've never had so much criticism in the Netherlands as after that, as we said that. But the thing of where can you have the most added value is certainly a very valid point, I think, in trying to decide on where you campaign or not. And then you have several countries. I remember in every general meeting of Amnesty, there came one guy in the beginning of the meeting and said, we need to have more attention for Indonesia and the Moluccans. And then, everyone in the audience said, yes, we should. And I said, maybe we should, but that will not go. So I had to defend that, that we try to weigh the different topics and that we couldn't say yes to everyone. But if you want one anecdote, and maybe if you don't want, I'll tell it anyway. There was, when I joined Amnesty, they had a new strategic plan, and this plan had 10 priorities, very important. So 10, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, very clear. They had a discussion on that, and maybe some things were changed, but then at the end of the discussion, one of the members said, I have an idea. I think these priorities are very important, but I think Amnesty should also keep on doing what I did until now, and I want to vote on that. And the vote was acclaimed by the general meeting. So that meant we had 10 priorities, but everything Amnesty did before that should also be keeping doing. So no priorities at all there. And that was when I started and say, friends, we need focus. So yeah, that would be my very long answer. So.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
There's one more question here.
Yeah.
Before we go to Kritika.
It is about the first presentation. I hear a lot of liberalistic ways of thinking, cost, benefit, and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, well, this is actually the cause of having poor countries, of having poor regions in the world. Aren't you making the same mistake as everyone does of making a cost benefit on everything and upholding a way of thinking that is actually the root cause of your problem that you're fighting?
Good question. So I see your point. I would kind of be skeptical that us thinking this way really strongly reinforces these biases in society. But maybe I'm wrong. I'm sure you, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure I have a good response to this. It seems plausible to me that maybe this way of thinking actually reinforces biases, maybe in the way we give, that does reinforce certain bad structures. But I would need to be convinced of that. Very happy to chat more about this.
I don't think it reinforces those structures. I think it's very important to Well, and as our moderator said, also to look, where's your passion? What do you feel like injustice or maybe something completely different or animal welfare or whatever. But where is your passion? And then see where could my contribution, my donation have the biggest impact. And for the short term, maybe that, well, that doesn't change the way the world is balancing in power, but it certainly helps a lot of people or animals to be helped and to be in a better position. And at some time, you will see that in organizations in the global south, they will have more power and they will be more critical towards what's happening here. You can see that development already, and the power balance, or if you put it another way, the decolonization of those bigger organizations is certainly an important issue. And that will continue to go on for the next 5 or 10 years or 15 years, I don't know. But for now, I think, well, the point that Jan has been making is very important. If you want to donate somewhere, try to see, you know, where your donation has the biggest impact. And of course, that will be Amnesty, but
Thank you. Very interesting. Let's give Kritika the floor now. It's a bit of a surprise that you're so on the same board, but obviously we're dealing with scarce resources, so it kind of feeds into the market system. But I think it's a very legitimate point. And after Kritika's
I will try
point,
to change
then
their mind.
I think we can
That's
go
my
deeper
task
into
today.
it. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to see that you've teamed up, and now this is me versus you. So I hope to present a different sort of philosophical view. And the way I will go about it is to sort of engage you more philosophically with the underpinnings of effective altruism and try and contrast that with another framework, another ethical framework of thinking. And that's not the only framework, but that's one that seems to stand in sharp contrast with what effective altruism sort of appeals to philosophically. So that's just me. The kind of question, this is not the main question that I'm posing for you, but this is just to sort of open the floor into asking ourselves, should we be doing good effectively or doing good with care? What do I mean by this question? I will try and explain in the next 10 minutes. In general, everything today that we've been talking about can sort of be addressed within this bigger umbrella of the ethics of giving. And here's a really good edited volume, if in case you're interested, to go through different philosophical perspectives into what that ethics of giving involves. But very generally, how we think about ethics of giving is in terms of doing good, which is exactly the first thing that we started with today. And when we do good, the idea is that we're also benefiting other people by doing that. And this is motivated by the idea that we seem to have some kind of a duty or some kind of a moral obligation of benevolence, which might be conditional, or sometimes it might be unconditional. So you might think that you have a conditional duty to help someone if you see them in need or if they require your help. Or it might be unconditional, that whenever you get a chance, under whatever circumstances possible, there is always at least an initial duty to help others by doing good. And the idea, for example, would translate into something like you having a moral obligation, or perhaps you being morally permissible to do good when possible by donating to charities like the Against Malaria Foundation or Amnesty, as we've been told earlier. Yet there is obviously a disagreement, not just philosophically, but also in practice, about how to achieve this good. And to consider that, I'll introduce you to two famous Dutch characters, Jip and Janneke. I'm currently obsessed with them because I'm trying to learn Dutch and I read a lot of Jip and Janneke. But the idea would be to consider two ways in which individuals might have very different moral perspectives about how we ought to go about doing good. And in doing that, how we ought to decide about how we were going to use our resources, for example, which charity we'll donate to. And even though today we've mostly been talking about different charities, the same the same way of asking this question can be applied to the kind of cause we might want to prioritize, and therefore try and think about which charity we might donate to. So here's how Jip thinks, and he seems to be a member of Effective Altruism, perhaps one of your friends. He's really moved by the idea of doing the most good or having the greatest impact with his resources in the most effective way. we've been told by Jan. Maybe this should be Jan, not Yip. So what Yip really adheres to is a version of effective altruism, because I've learned that there's a variety of versions of effective altruism with different sort of commitments. But at least according to one version of effective altruism, we have a duty to do the most good possible, which in moral terms translates to the idea that if you're not doing the most good possible, you're acting morally wrongly, at least on one version of this thesis. And in thinking about goodness here, the idea or the underlying sort of philosophical commitment is to think about rightness, moral rightness in this case, of an action or social intervention or social behavior, whatever it may be, as a function of only and only its consequences, with the outcome involving the best state of affairs, counting as doing the most good. So we're here only thinking in terms of consequences. This might sound a lot like consequentialism if you've taken a philosophy class, but it's not equivalent to it, but it's informed by it, at least according to some philosophers. So here are some of the common philosophical tenets, this kind of reasoning Yip is going to think about when he's thinking about which charity to donate to. So he's thinking about maximization of well-being. So in this case, earlier we had a question about how do we think about what is good. And the most common way of capturing that goodness is by considering goodness in terms of improvement of well-beings. And there's various ways of doing that, but for now we can sort of move away from the details. And as I said earlier, this has sort of consequentialist line of reasoning built into it, that we think about consequences as the only way in which we determine the goodness or badness of our actions. And the third one, which Jan earlier on emphasized in his presentation, is this reliance on careful reasoning and evidence collection and basing our understanding of what would be the most cost-effective way of bringing about the most good by looking into what science informs us of. But one last consideration that was sort of missing but implicit in Jan's presentation was about impartiality. That when we are committed to something like effective altruism or some thesis of it, we're also morally at least obligated to act impartially, which is just to say that everybody's well-being should count equally. So, for example, in the many different examples that Eduardo gave earlier, you ought to treat all the suffering or the well-being of people involved in different scenarios and the kind of harms they're being faced with as at an equal level. So no special consideration to one cause or the other, at least prior to any further consideration, right? But here's Yannicka, and she disagrees with Yip heavily. And Yannicka sort of bases her thinking about what we ought to do by appealing to this ethical framework of care, which stems from a lot of historical feminist theorizing about what care requires, what care is, and what role it has in thinking about how we ought to act. So in a way, it's an alternative moral framework that emphasizes that there is something like an intrinsic, a non-instrumental kind of value of care that we should have towards others, or the kind of disposition perhaps we should have towards others. And in doing that, it doesn't disregard that the consequences of our actions matter morally, but it says that there are various other moral considerations that at least sometimes may outweigh, or maybe sometimes even compete, with this idea of maximizing goodness or doing the most good that we can, right? But at the same time, it also shifts away from our effective altruist dispositions by saying that duty of care does not impose an obligation to use our resources effectively. What matters is to what extent are we considering other people's needs and interests, and even though by doing that we will come close to deciding on an action that may not do the most good, that may not maximize well-being or goodness or anything else that you consider good in the most effective way possible, but it does give due consideration to very important moral aspects of what it means to care for another person. So in that sense, the framework that Yannicka is appealing to puts a lot of, or at least it holds a lot of weight to the moral significance of some fundamental elements of the relationships and the dependencies that humans encounter when they navigate the social world with each other. And it also emphasizes the idea that maintaining relationships by contextualizing them and by promoting the well-being of others in a wide network of moral and social relations is an important consideration. So it's not just about thinking of goodness in abstract, which is somewhere which we're going to promote and maximize by acting in one way or the other, but it wants to additionally consider that we're also acting in favor of goodness that means something for individuals. It's embodied by humans, by people who we stand in important moral relationships with. And in doing that, the framework is at least able to capture or at least address some of the things that we find important, such as the different situated vulnerabilities that people in need have and are confronted with in their lives, which we don't think of when we're only thinking about the maximization of value, because that requires us to abstract away from these important different aspects of people's life. And in doing that, it also moves away from the earlier consideration that effective altruism upholds, which is of partiality, that at least a thesis of care and ethics of care can allow for impartiality considerations. So, for example, it can allow us to recognize certain special obligations or commitments you may have. So, for example, as was voiced earlier in one of the discussion questions, that if you feel more passionate about certain cause, because perhaps you have some personal close relationships with people who are suffering in Ukraine at the moment, this sort of a framework would allow you to give special consideration to those people, even though when some action that you can take to prevent their suffering may not do the most amount of good in the most effective way. So, but this is not to say that both these theses, one that's grounded more in effective altruism considerations and one that's more focused on care, are entirely incompatible. So there is some level of compatibility question. So you might think that doing the most good in the most effective way can at least sometimes align with also giving due care to, for example, respecting people's dignity, their moral worth, and not only trying and aiming to maximize value. But that's not necessarily always the case. And that's why this discussion becomes interesting. Because this is when we're required to sort of make choices if we are going to be more effective altruists in our commitments in thinking about how we ought to do good or do the most good, or we're going to support interventions that may not be motivated or supported by effective altruist reasonings, but may be supported by other forms of ethical reasoning that also gives sort of due considerations to concerns like caring for other people. And I personally do think that there is some advantages, or at least some reasons to prefer the latter approach, than not just be effective altruists. Sorry, yeah. And at least one of the reasons for why I think that is the case is because it at least avoids fetishizing effectiveness. This is an existing critique of effective altruism, that we're so enforced to constantly think about what's most effective is something that should cause us for concern, because it speaks to the language of, let's say, a very capital-focused society that wants individuals to do things more effectively, produce things more effectively. And if, as a society, we want to move away from a social structure like that, maybe our moral reasoning for how we ought to contribute to charities should also focus away from wanting to do things as effectively as possible. And another virtue of focusing more on care rather than costs could be that at least it allows us to care for concerns that can't always be quantified and at the same time can't always be instrumentalized for the sake of being promoted or maximized in terms of its value. And also it seems that, at least for some kinds of values, there's something morally wrong about instrumentalizing them. For example, instrumentalizing care just for the sake of promoting the value of care, because it takes away the focus from thinking about care in relation with the people we have it for, rather than thinking about it as an abstract quantity that can be maximized for its own sake. And at the same time, when we focus more on this aspect of care, we also recognize that the virtue of care is valuable in and of itself. And it's valuable even over and above the quantifiable goods that we can think about maximizing maximizing and then fitting in our sort of cost effectiveness framework. Besides that, you might also think that effective altruism, for instance, requires reliance on this quantifiability of goods in order to be able to say what needs to be, whether or not some action is cost effective. But in the case of care ethics, there is no necessary requirement into having to quantify evidence of the kind that only certain scientific methods can provide. And in doing that, it also seems to avoid certain critiques of measurability bias, that perhaps if we lean too much heavily on cost effectiveness as a methodology, we only tend to focus on those kinds of causes and concerns that can be quantified or measured, and that sort of moves away from causes and concerns that can't be done in the same way. And that's an existing critique where a lot of philosophers have had responses to. But in case of care ethics, it seems that it's very hard to quantify what degree of care, what quality of care you can owe other people, and in the same way put it in the box of cost-effective measurements and say whether or not to maximize that. Or at least that would go against the very essential tenets of the theory itself. And lastly, it also seems that only focusing on maximization of value makes us perhaps insensitive towards social and moral inequalities amongst people, the existence of class structures, various systemic injustices that might also inform what kind of charities we ought to, or what kind of causes we ought to donate to. But it could be that if we're only focused on science-informed maximization of welfare, because we are sort of striving towards doing the most good most effectively, we might be, as pointed out earlier, we might be contributing to exactly the causes that uphold these moral inequalities, or that uphold these class structures or systemic injustices that we want to fight. Lastly, the main differentiating factor between the two approaches, which is of partiality. Effective altruists sort of pride themselves for being impartial, for being able to give equal concern to everyone's welfare without making any sort of discrimination between whose welfare counts for most. At least on some versions, as I said. But it seems that partiality can also be morally laudable, sometimes, at least in cases where, for instance, being impartial is intuitively bad because it involves failures to treat others as worthy of dignity and respect. Or, for example, when it stops us from avoiding immediate suffering, because, for instance, as you may remember from your reading of Peter Singer's famous Pond case, if you were to choose between saving a drowning child in front of you or using the same resources and time to save 10 children or more, or do other good or most good in another country, you might be confronted with the fact that there is something morally problematic in not saving the child that is in front of you just because you can maybe do more good effectively by going back home, going on the internet and sending your money somewhere else. At least that seems to be an initial cause for pausing and asking ourselves whether or not we should only focus ourselves into value maximization, or should we also give some due consideration to other moral values such as care. And with that, I leave you with a question. In deciding how to do good by way of donating to charities, ought we at least sometimes choose to act partially, or should we not? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a thought-provoking account. Then maybe first give chance to react. So how impartial are you?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks a lot for the talk. I think this is super valuable to have people seriously engaging with effective altruism and criticizing us, because if we're wrong or if I'm wrong, then I definitely want to know. So thanks for your very valid criticisms. I would kind of love to know how you think doing charity in the best way in practice would look differently if you apply an ethics of care instead of an effective altruism mindset.
That's a good question. So the first immediate way it would look different is the way you would reason, or the way you would justify supporting cause A over cause B, let's say, and you can fill in the details as you wish. So that would be one. The other would be that in choosing A or B, your first sort of moral consideration would not necessarily be, as you were pointing out earlier, is whether doing supporting cause A would be the most cost-effective way of using your resources or time, because it might be that if once you consider things like, do I, for example, treat people with respect, or do I respect the duties of care that I may owe to people, it might be that despite being not the most cost-effective way of being able to do the most good, you might be, at least you might have good, strong moral, deontological reasons for supporting cause B, regardless of the fact that you could have promoted the most good by just doing it. And I do think that sometimes we forget, at least in our discussions around cost effectiveness, that, for instance, in fulfilling your independent obligations, you might have to people, for instance, in your own country. You cannot quantify the goodness of having done that necessarily so. But you do, at least, you are moved by certain ontological concerns that do not necessarily respect the cost-benefit analysis, and they needn't respect the cost-benefit analysis. So that is, at least, there are two ways in which, in practice, you might see the difference in thinking about other moral considerations.
May I ask Pietka first to explain? You mentioned structural injustice. I don't know whether you know this, but it relates quite well, I think, to Eduard's work. Maybe you can explain what structural injustice is, and Eduard, you can give a reaction to that.
I feel like I don't need to explain structural injustices to this audience. I don't want this to be an instance of women's campaigning, but very vaguely, of course, it's a very broadly understood idea that injustices are, so just to start off with the distinction. So you may think of an instance of interpersonal injustice. So for instance, I run over you because I'm drunk driving, and I don't owe you back the compensation, I don't take you to the hospital. It seems that I've not only harmed you, but I've acted unjustly towards you. Because as a moral victim, as a moral patient, I've done something wrong. And that's an instance of interpersonal relationship because it involves two individuals like you and I. But there are cases where injustice is inbuilt in the very fabric or the very structures of our society. So you cannot necessarily point to particular individuals who might be sort of part of some set of coordinated actions in producing results of unfairness, or more broadly understood as injustice. But the root cause stems from the kind of structures that we create, the institutions that we create in producing wrongs that involve injustice. That's sort of the structural difference between what interpersonal and structural injustice is. And clearly the kind of examples that Eduardo was discussing in the beginning seem to be cases of structural injustices that are, of course, conducted on part of individuals because they involve individual actors, but these actors are also part of various structures, not just one, of course, there are various structures involved.
I'm thinking as good as I can, and I don't know if I have a good reaction to all this, but the structural injustice and individuals, it's a very complex topic. And if I look at the debate on discrimination in the Netherlands, I don't know how long most of you are in the Netherlands, but if you look at the discussion around Zwarte Piet, Black Piet, the action group Kick Out Zwarte Piet started 10, 12 years ago, and then I thought, well, we could exaggerate what's happening. And I'm very frank on that. But then, after having talked to some of those activists, I thought, well, maybe there's something in it. And I think a lot of people, a lot of individuals in the Netherlands didn't realize how structural discrimination and racism is in Dutch society, in this example, in this event of Sinterklaas and Zwarte Piet, but also in their own behavior towards that. And saying, like very many people, that, well, it's tradition and we don't mean any harm, doesn't mean that no harm was done to individuals that feel ridiculized by this tradition. And so, and then back to doing good and trying to come to a just society as Kritika, well, I would love to have your slides, to think a bit more on that. But what is needed for a just society is, at least if you look at this little example, that is that Kick-Out Zwarte Piet could do what it did, and I've been, Maasluis is very near here, I think. When they were demonstrating in Maasluis, the mayor of Maasluis had some measures of the police intervening, and we said as MSC, you shouldn't have done that. And he was really furious. And the mayor of Rotterdam the same. He said, well, he was really furious when I went to him afterwards that we were critical of that. And I think if you would look now, then the situation towards this, except for some places in Friesland, but is totally different. At the same time, you can see that the right on demonstration, that the Kick-Out Zwarte Piet has now more or less won the debate, but the situation of Extinction Rebellion is also a very good example compared to Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. They did an extremely good job, but what police did there and trying to prevent demonstration and getting people out of bed in order to prevent that they can go to this place, and the way they interfere in demonstrations, police should facilitate demonstrations, not keeping them away. So, and there you can see the same, maybe a bit of the same pattern, thinking loudly, that people do not realize maybe how important it is that we really cherish the value of the freedom of demonstration, and at the same time, we have an enormous debate where politicians say more and more those eco-terrorists and that kind of words that they shouldn't do, and they should leave the judgment to judges. But maybe that's very old-fashioned, but that's the way our constitution is constituted. So you can see some developments in that, but the basic question of doing good, of caring, is that sometimes you need to be woken up. You need a wake-up call in order to be able to change things, and that always will be difficult. It will be always contested, and then there is the huge value of the freedom of expression, which we happily still have in the Netherlands, but well, it's not said that this will be uncontested. But that's the way to continue the debate, and that's the same as here. Of course, well, I don't think effective altruism wants to fetish the way you reason about doing good and about investing in good causes or donations. But I think also the Janneke approach is very worthwhile to try to incorporate in the thinking. And I'm not smart enough to do that now on the spot, but if you incorporate some of those ideas, I think the very straight and direct way of trying to reason to some organization could be at least, we have a more complex way of coming to that, a more rich way of coming to that. And in fact, that was also what I tried to say in my presentation, that there's not one way that leads to end of injustice and to say, well, this is good and this is working immediately. But in very complex situations, it's good to look a bit more at the context. And that was a very good call from your presentation. Sorry for being so long, but it was a very difficult topic.
Questions from the others?
Okay. Isn't being emotionally involved not only lead you to being less efficient, but actually taking the wrong moral choice? I mean, for example, giving money to an addict. Giving money to an addict, for example. That's, you could be emotionally not into that, that's the wrong word. You could be, you know, you have feelings, you feel for the man that he's in need, right? But it's the wrong choice. So isn't, you know, doing things impartially the best way of not doing mistakes, not being efficient or doing the most good, but not making mistakes?
Well, I live in Utrecht, and Utrecht has some addicts that are begging in the streets. And sometimes, well, I know it doesn't help, but sometimes it's so heartbreaking that I think, well, here you are, and I know it doesn't help maybe in the longer term, but at least they can have their stuff done, or they can go to a homeless shelter. At the same time, I don't do that, but at the same time, the municipality of Utrecht has a very good policy towards homeless, towards addicts, etc. And I also wonder, why is this individual not in this program? But I didn't have the courage to ask him in this case, because he was in such a bad shape that I don't think any normal conversation could happen. But you word it very strongly, and I don't think it's wrong to do. Maybe it's silly to do, it's a bit naive to do, and I also think, well, at least if it helps such an individual for one day, at least he's out of misery for that one day, and maybe that's also something worthwhile to consider. And maybe I'm naive or whatever, but sometimes it's so difficult just to pass by and to know that you're in a wealthy position, and just think, well, he should have been taking care of himself much more early, or that's too easy, I think.
I also reacted because without an emotion, you would do nothing. I mean, that's essentially how so if you don't have the emotion, and I think that makes the whole effective altruism debate so interesting, because you have to have this emotion, you have to have this care, otherwise you don't say, I'm going to give charity to charity because you don't feel anything. But then, yeah, this ideal of rationality kicks in, and then you start thinking about, wait a minute, just throwing money at this junk doesn't help me. Then you start thinking, okay, how can I use my emotion to the best way? And I think that's the complication there. Oh yeah.
I guess I was taking things too literally. I thought only like in black and white, like, okay, I'm either emotionally attached or not at all. But indeed, it's a gray area. So now that I think about it, my question wasn't that.
Yeah. I think learn to engage with the gray areas. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, this is a funny thing, because I was thinking about an example. If you go to Hungary and you see a homeless person and you give her or him money and you walk by like you would do in the Netherlands, people would think that is extremely rude, because you pay no respect to that person. And that is the same point I'm trying to make with altruism. You're giving money like we tend to do with homeless people in the Netherlands, but you're not giving respect. You're missing the point of doing good. You're missing the point of being a person that is doing good, and you're just valuing money and saying, well, I did good because I gave that money, but you're not being good as a person. How do you think on that? Yeah, you're the altruistic guys, so I'm like pointing to you, but the others as well. So, do you see the danger of thinking that way, or?
So to try to summarize your point, you're saying that just doing good is not all that's about it. It's also about like respecting the other person. And
no, I'm saying like doing good is not putting money effectively. Doing good is more. Doing good is paying respect to that homeless person on the street and not just giving €5 or dollars. I think it's too limited to think.
I think it ties in with Kritka's point about dignity that every human being deserves, and if you just give money, if you throw it in his face, you don't give this dignity. So I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that with giving, you also should account for the dignity to the people that you give your money to. It's not just buying your guilt off this.
I do feel like giving people in need things which help them to, like, for example, prevent their children from dying or help them live like more flourishing lives is actually quite a respectful thing to do. So like giving, like for example, donating malaria nets, which I think people in these areas need, and like really does help them to like later on live more flourishing lives because their children are not sick or they themselves do not grow sick. That seems to me like quite a respectful thing to do. But yeah, maybe someone wants to disagree here.
Oh, yeah, I also maybe wanted to respond to you. So I think since we are living in kind of society based on money and capitalism, in a sense, I mean, money is a universal way of saying, I do care about this. Because this is, I mean, this kind of, yeah, this is like a thing that you can exchange for anything, or well, anything else, not anything else, but for many things that will improve your lives. And so I think the act of giving money, even if you don't give anything, of course, I mean, it's better if you also give the respect. I completely agree with that. But even just giving the money without and just walking by, I would say that is still a form of paying respect to that person compared to not giving that money.
If I may speak on your behalf. I think the point that you were trying to maybe allude to was not just the fact that in giving money away, also the way we are visualizing it is perhaps in a very particular sort of disrespectful manner that you throw money at somebody because you see them in need and your moral is sort of shaken off. I think the idea which you were maybe alluding to was that we should be sort of morally motivated in order to give help, maybe in the form of cash payments, or maybe in the form of other kinds of social interventions that bring about certain levels of well-being, or that pushes these people up to a certain level of well-being which we find desirable, should be motivated or at least be dictated by the very fact that we're engaging ourselves with moral agents that are owed certain levels of respect and dignity. But when we move away from that kind of moral reasoning or explanation for what morally motivates us and respond to the question of why did you help this person, or why did you give a certain amount of money because you thought that that was the most cost-effective way of making use of your resources, perhaps that's where the sense of disrespect or lack of consideration of that person as a moral agent comes into being, because what we're morally motivated by in the second case is by the fact that I want to make sure that every penny I spend adds the most amount of value into the world. But the adding of value into the world as an abstract thing sort of takes us away from thinking about the person as somebody who is owed certain kinds of respect, or at least it's not always compatible with promoting value in abstract versus doing something for the person because of the people they are who are deserving of our moral respect and attention. But I see you shake your head, so please.
But I mean, my response to that would be is that the fact that you are giving money to them is, I mean, it is not just a fetishization or fetishization of effectiveness or of giving money, right? The reason why someone in effective altruism or anyone giving to charity gives that money is because they really do have this sense of caring and this sense of duty or towards other people, and this sense of respect to other people that they think they deserve to have a better life, right? So I would kind of challenge your point that effective altruism does this fetishization of effectiveness. It's I mean, in a sense, it's true, but it's only because we really do care about it. And we really do care about doing good.
I would think of that more as a paradox as opposed to saying that on the one hand you do care about people and you're motivated because people are sort of owed respect is what also motivates you to do good in the most effective way can often come in conflict, right? So I'm not challenging, I'm not questioning the moral motivations that you, particularly as an effective altruist or the community in general, might be motivated. What I'm alluding to is the underlying philosophical thesis that justifies giving to cause A or B, which is not to say that particular individuals involved in this movement or cause are not motivated by a sense of caring, but it is to allude to the fact that if we're going to justify having donated to cause A or B, and if our justification takes the shape of appealing to certain kinds of cost-effective measures, that is not the the same explanation as saying that I want to help this person because this person is worthy of deserving moral respect. You might appeal to that as a second-order explanation, but that's clearly not the first-order explanation when the thesis of effective altruism in and of itself says definitionally that you ought to do the most good in the most effective way possible. It doesn't say you ought to do the most good because people are worthy of respect. At least that would be my initial sort of knee-jerk reaction, but happy to talk about it.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean,
The thing is, it was more like what you're giving money for. So, am I giving money to help him, or am I giving money to like leave me alone? And if you're only giving money, that's up to question for the person you're giving money to. But if you take that extra step, you might actually indicate to him that, well, I'm doing this out of care for you, not only for you to leave me alone. That was what I understood from what my colleague said. Yeah, that was the thing, because money is a way of, it's time, it's work, it's a way of representing this. But what am I paying you for, right? Why am I giving you this money? To either help you or to leave me alone. That's
If I could,
Yeah, sure.
if I could just briefly say, well, it depends also very much on how this organization then operates. And a long time ago, and that's one of the advantages of getting older, a long time ago I did a project with some parts of university here in order to see how elderly people, to research how elderly people perceived the help by voluntary organizations. Because there was a lot of voluntary organizations, we're talking 1986 or 7, voluntary organizations that assisted elderly people that were dependent on care. Professional care was not enough available, a family couldn't help, so a volunteer comes in. One of the things that people disliked most was that a volunteer comes in and said, well, you should be happy that I'm here to help you. And that attitude of coming from above and saying to somebody, well, you're in a very poor position, but happily I'm there to assist you. So that was disrespecting their dignity, and to a very high extent. And then that came into the open. Organizations like the Red Cross or the Dutch Organization for Women Volunteers, they really disliked the results of this project, but they had to admit too that something needed to change. And if you work for refugees, for instance, there's the same danger that people say, well, you're a refugee, so you should be, of course, very grateful for me helping you and assisting you and all kind. And I think, well, basically, some of them think they told me, fuck you, I know I can make my own decisions and I know what's happening. If you just tell me a few things, I can do a lot of things myself. But taking people's hand and then taking them on board is often not a good way of expressing respect and respecting their dignity. And dignity is in the core of human rights. The first sentence of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights is, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And the dignity is before the rights. So all human beings, free, equal, dignity, rights. And I think it's very important that if you look at organizations to donate, not only to look at effectiveness, but also the way they operate. Do they respect the dignity of the people they work for?
Yeah. Or, sure.
Adding to this discussion, I clearly see the value of an initiative that you are giving. Also understanding the fact that we operate in different markets, including the humanitarian market, also political markets by which, for example, big advocacy organizations are competing or are engaging. And that's why, for example, I think that the tool that you design is very valuable in order to identify those organizations which actually instrumentalize charity for business, because that huge problem, if you go actually to the field, is this number of organizations that claims that they deliver very basic things, but they don't, and they get, let's say, rent capture. So I understand that. on the other hand, I still believe that the problem with charity, one looks historically, is that, say, avoid the core discussion of the circumstances that are leading to the injustice in practice to people. Actually, if you see, for example, before the movement of labor and so on, charity was the idea by which the high class addressed the problem of poverty, right? And the reaction, for example, the human rights, but also the labor rights, comes against the very idea that charity could solve everything. So in that sense, maybe the discussion is to which extent we are attributing, let's say, power to the very idea of charity, right? So it has like a scope that is valuable, right? Specifically for some people which feels compelled to help by allocating money, but that doesn't say address all the moral problems that one could engage. So that I think that in that sense is still a valuable tool.
Yeah.
What you were saying to me is a bit like, besides doing good, you can use also charities kind of to promote certain of your own values. Human rights, for example, Amnesty, but also nature preservation. So I think that comes a bit back to what I also said earlier about choosing at the beginning from how to define good. You can use the charity that you donate to also to promote your views, so to speak, of how the world should be. More freedom, more nature, less nature, whatever you want. But that's. I was a bit triggered when you said the power of the charity as a tool to shape.
Yeah. Maybe an assumption that I had in my mind is that, for example, I have experience in the water sector. The water sector is very easy to, for example, deliver WASH, which is water sanitation and hygiene, because it's measurable, it's very practical, the impact you can measure, and that's why you can make the metrics, right? But it's really the problem of people who have this problem of no access of water, a matter of just bringing them water? No, exactly. So that's why, for example, when I was referring to these kind of tools, which are very oriented to the things that you can measure in health, in water, basically the thing that they're addressing are those services that, if you compare in the history, was the lack of access to those services that triggers, for example, the social movement and say, okay, what is the first condition that I'm suffering for not having access to water? So charity, the thing is like they're giving like an aspirine to the problem of a cancer. So that's the thing that I think is the risk when you are only looking at the cost-efficient thing, because usually you need to reduce the measuring so far that you can prove that it is cost-efficient. So I think, and there is a market of people there that are trying to capture, because there is a market there. So maybe that was the assumption that was never explicit. Sometimes I had the assumption in my mind that I don't explain, sorry for that.
I think what you mean is the charity or whatever should address the cause and not the symptom.
Like there is some charity that address the symptom, for example, the nets for malaria. Like this is very practical, delivers things, but maybe that doesn't mean that it's important not overlooking all the other things that you can engage in other levels of charity. For example, engaging with the discussion of CO2 emissions, or even the rights in certain kind of population. So that's why it's more the risky thing of measuring things, because you need to reduce in order to be reliable and valid in statistical terms, for example. Otherwise, then the numbers are just fabricating some reality that can be even more dangerous.
It's about time, so we have to cut up. But we give the last opportunity to our panel to give some reactions, to some closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion there. I'd like to point out that effective charities doesn't always mean there's a randomized control trials for these things. For example, it could also mean that we have like very good logical reasons to believe this is very effective. So effective altruism is not fundamentally opposed to pushing for social change and trying to change these systems. I think one problem might be that these things are very like hard to change for individual donors, and because there's a lot of governments which try to influence things, there's a lot of big players trying to like influence these systems. So us as small donors don't hold like big power. And also I have like very little idea of what's going on in these countries and which social change we should push for. So I feel like it's a safer approach for me to just empower people there by, for example, like improving health, improving economical wealth for these people, and like giving them more opportunities and empowering them to, yeah, make the change they want to see in the world.
Well, I don't have any famous last remarks for now. I'm sorry, but just wanted to say I really liked the interaction in the last part, also the introductions, but it was very, very good to see how you were thinking in the audience and formulating dilemmas, because this is a lot on dilemmas and choosing the best possible way maybe to proceed. And I hugely like that, and certainly also food for thought and a very rich discussion. So thank you for that.
I also don't have anything new to add, but perhaps one last thing I would say is that doing good is not always about what I can do as good or what I as an individual ought to do in terms of doing good, but it's also a collective action problem. It's also about what we can do as good. So perhaps for the second version of this talk, we should have a version of doing good collectively perhaps and see what the discussion entails. But thank you for your participation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you. We're coming at the end of this. I still think we're all about on the same page. There's no underlying disagreement. We have some slight nuanced differences in how to engage with charity, but I think that's good. Thank you. Thank our panelists. Thank Lester for organizing. And
thank you. Thank you very much indeed. If you're interested in continuing the conversation, there's in fact another event tonight at 8:45. Check our website, which is also about altruism, but will allow even more interpersonal conversation. But also feel free to continue the conversation right now here. We still have some drinks left, so please do help us out with that. Thank you all for coming.